This here program is called Language in Action. It's all about words, what they are and how we use them.
Really, Crashaw? This is embarrassing. Do you have the slightest idea what you're talking about?
Ah, you're so dusty you make me sneeze. Of course I know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about semantics.
Semantics? Really? Tell me, Crashaw, have you ever looked up the word in the dictionary?
Dictionary? What for? I've been listening to Doc Hayakawa. I know what semantics is.
Well, how can you possibly know the meaning of the word if you haven't looked it up in the dictionary? The dictionary, my dear misguided peasant, is the one infallible book of rules on the meaning of words.
Oh, go stick your head in the dictionary and close the cover.
You'll talk to me that way.
I will so. No, you won't. Wait a minute. Dictionary or not, it's about time that we introduce the third man on this program, Dr. S.I. Hayakawa.
Thank you, Mr. Crashaw. Thank you, Mr. Fudley, for your graceful introduction. Today, I should like to discuss the subject of dictionaries. We are all brought up, of course, to be quite respectful of dictionaries, and we often feel that we should consult them oftener than we do, and I suppose we should. But in order to understand exactly what it is that the authority of a dictionary rests upon, I'd like to examine today the process by which a dictionary is made. And I think it's quite important that we understand this process, because most people, while they have been taught to be respectful of dictionaries, they have no idea in what ways or why they should be respectful, or where the limits of a dictionary's authority may lie. I wonder if you've ever wondered to yourself what goes on in the office where they're working on the writing of dictionaries. Obviously, a vast amount of research goes on. And I'd like to describe to you next the kind of research that happens. Basically, the research is a matter of reading vast amounts of literature covering every field of knowledge. And as the readers read, they copy onto cards the interesting new words they find, all new words they find. They also copy onto cards old words found in new or strange uses, or new combinations of words. And every time they come across a word, then they write it down upon a card, and along with the word itself, they write the sentence or the context in which the word appears, so that the context itself will reveal something about the meaning of the word. And in a vast project of dictionary making, such as the New English Dictionary on Historical Principles, which we commonly call the Oxford Dictionary, millions and millions of cards were collected, and all these cards then had to be sorted, alphabetized, filed, and so on before the basic work of writing definitions began. And what I would like to do next then is to show you a sample of the kind of card that they use for this purpose and how these things are annotated and organized. Let me see. This would be as good an example as any, I imagine. Here, let's draw on the blackboard a sample card. And in the upper left-hand corner, you would put down the word, in this case, pale. And under it, you would have the quotation, which illustrates the use of that word, the dairy pails bring home increase of milk. And then you give the author, Keats, and the source, Endymion, and the page reference, Book 1, line 44. And in this way, you have then not only the word that you want to illustrate, but the illustrative quotation. And notice how carefully the quotation is chosen. The word milk, bring home, dairy, all help to clarify what is meant by the word pail in case you've never come across that particular word before. Now, after then you've collected a large number of cards for a given word, you have to sort them out because each word, practically every word, has a variety of meanings. And I'd like to show you a little bit about how this sorting process goes on and what the problems are that come up in connection with this project. Let's assume here that we have a stack of cards illustrating uses of the word frog, F-R-O-G. And here, let's say, is a card with the word frog on the corner. Before they went fishing, they caught some frogs to use for bait. This obviously refers to the small amphibian reptile, Rana pipiens, which we all commonly know in our ponds and streams. But here's a use of the word frog. The frog came loose on his bow, so he had to stop playing. And from further context, we know that the he refers to a violinist. So it's a violinist's bow, and frog then must be a part of a violinist's bow that can come loose. Here's another use of the word frog. The blacksmith pared the hoof and frog before he reshod the horse. So you couldn't put that in the same pile, so you have to start a new pile for that use of the word frog. He had a frog in his throat. That's still a new one. Here's an observation picked up by a linguist. Outside of Hamilton, Ohio, an observer saw a factory with the name on the outside, American Frog and Plate Company. And he discovers that this is a company that makes crossing plates for railroad tracks. American Frog and Plate Company. Here's another use of the word frog, which perhaps is unfamiliar to most of my masculine listeners. The robe is fastened with ornamental frogs of braided silk material, a dressmaker's term for a certain kind of fastening for coats and dresses. Frog, a loop, normally of leather, for holding a sword, a term used in cavalry, and so on. Well, here are all these different uses of the word frog then, accumulating, and separate uses would have to be distinguished, and on the basis of each of these piles, then the dictionary writer defines specific uses of a word. In other words, he must work by the cards and by the evidence in front of him on how the words have been used, or he's not writing a dictionary. By this I mean that, like anyone else, the writer of dictionary may have his private prejudices, his private preconceptions as to how certain words ought to be used, or what they ought to mean, or what they ought not to mean, and so on. But the writer of a dictionary cannot be influenced by his own private views. He must follow the cards, which record the actual usage of people using the English or the American language. And so, it's profoundly to be considered then that a dictionary does not set up the meanings of words. It merely records what various words have meant to the various people who've used them up to the time the dictionary was written. But notice that the language is always changing. For example, during the first 9 months of 1957, most Americans had never heard the word Sputnik. Then, suddenly in October, the word Sputnik became one that everyone could recognize and even use. In other words, this word had been added to the American language by simply by the historical course of events. And this word Sputnik then illustrates the fact that a dictionary, in a sense, is already out of date by the time it's published. Let me give an analogy to explain this point. Supposing you had your photograph taken a week ago, and today you are looking at the proofs. Is this a picture of you? Well, yes, it is, but also it's a picture of you as you looked a week ago, not exactly the way you look today. And it may be a good enough picture for practical purposes, but notice the sense in which it is out of date. And in a similar way, then, a dictionary cannot actually keep up with the language. It always must, of necessity, remain slightly out of date in some respects. I might summarize this point by saying, then, that the writer of a dictionary, then, is a historian of the language, not a lawgiver.
See? What did I tell you? The dictionary ain't no rule book. You just heard the doc say so.
Well, to be exact, Crashaw, the doctor said the writer of a dictionary is a historian, not a lawgiver. Tell me, Crashaw, what's the meaning of the word epistemology?
Epista what? Oh, how should I know? Look it up in the dictionary.
Exactly, my dear fellow. Just what I've been trying to tell you. The only way to find out the meaning of a word you've never heard before is to look it up in the dictionary. I tell you, there is simply no other way to find out what words mean.
Maybe you're right. What was that word you threw at me a minute ago? See, sub-epistemology.
Wait a minute. Fudley, I think you go a little too far when you say it's the only way to find out what words mean, and you've always got to look at a dictionary for the meanings of words. Because, well, think about it for a moment. How did we all learn the language to start with when we were small children? Do we equip a 2-year-old child with a dictionary because he's just learning the language? No, somehow or other, children learn the language without one. And how do they do this? Well, actually, if you think about the process, the child hears the word, he hears it in the context of activities and events and things happening around him. And as he listens to these strange sounds, which he will later identify as words, he correlates them to those events and things that are happening around him. He correlates the word biscuit with the object biscuit, lunch with the event lunch, and so on. And gradually he picks up the language without ever having had a dictionary to consult. In other words, they learn from the totality of contexts. And when you come to think of it, is this not the way in which we learn most of our vocabulary, not only as children, but also in our adult life? Let's imagine you are among a group of friends and you hear a word that you've never heard before. Let us say, in this case, the word oboe, O-B-O-E. First you hear somebody say, Frank is the best oboe player in town. Well, you don't know what it means, but you know that oboe is something you play. Maybe it's a game. Well, maybe it's a musical instrument. So you listen until the word turns up again. And let's say that you hear that Frank does especially well in that oboe passage in the third movement. Well, when you hear that, you know it isn't a game. It has something to do with music. And then when later on in the conversation you hear someone say, I like the oboe. In fact, I like all the woodwinds better than I like the brasses. In that case, you've finally got it narrowed down that an oboe is a woodwind instrument. This is how we pick up vocabulary, by simply being sensitive to the verbal context in which unfamiliar words appear. The same principle holds true for physical context as well. Let's imagine that you've never played golf before, but you finally decide to take up the game. And so you go out to the golf course with a friend, and you learn to hit the ball. And as you hit the ball goes off, way off to the right. And your friend says to you, well, you did fine hitting it, but it was a bad slice. And so you learn that that's a bad slice. So you keep on hitting the ball. And you say to yourself, quite often, that's a bad slice again. And then once, when you hit the ball this way this time, you say, that's a bad slice, and your friend says to you, oh, no, that wasn't a slice this time, that's a hook. Oh, you say, that's a hook. Well, isn't that the way one learns? And after even 9 holes of golf, haven't you acquired a vocabulary in the very course of action of applying that vocabulary? You've learned the meanings of words like number 5 iron, divot, bunker, slice, hook, mashie, putter, and so on. And all these words you've acquired and in their exact and correct meanings without ever having consulted a dictionary once. And this is what I mean when I say that we do learn much of our vocabulary from the simple physical context in which we find our words. In contrast to this, let's look at the dictionary definition of the word slice. I've looked this up. In golf, to strike the ball in such a way as to draw the face of the club inward across the ball, causing it to swerve to the right in flight, in the case of a right-handed player.
Yeah, that's right. You tell 'em, Doc. Did you hear that, you talking dustbin? You don't need a dictionary to figure out what words mean.
Crasshaw, as I have told you time and time again, you don't know what you're talking about.
I do so, and I'll prove it to you. What's the meaning of the word fence? I'll bet you don't know that.
Why, of course I do. A fence is an enclosing structure. It can also mean swordplay. Oh, God!
Ow! Now, you cut that out. Listen a minute. The kind of fence I'm talking about is the kind that handles hot goods, see?
Oh, don't be silly, Crasshaw. You're using the word as if it meant a person.
That's right, Daddy-O. Now, you listen some more. A good second-story man needs a fence. A fence's specialty is moving merchandise that's been heisted. Follow me? I once knew a fence that got real fat from a whole stable of light-fingered guys bringing them stuff. Why, man, did they gripe at the low percentage he paid. But he had 'em over a barrel, see?
I infer from what you've said, Crasshaw, that a fence is a person who buys stolen goods from thieves and disposes of those goods at considerable profit to himself.
Well, how did you ever get it? You must have used a dictionary, huh?
Oh!
That's a nice demonstration, Crasshaw. And there is something else about dictionaries. Actually, what they do is to explain words with more words. Now, supposing we were to look up a word in a dictionary and cannot understand the definition. What do you do then? Then, of course, we look up the defining words. Then, supposing that we don't understand the words defining the defining words, then you have to look them up. What happens, of course, is that if this process continues, you're involved in what mathematicians call infinite regress. Or sometimes the problem can be a problem of circularity in definitions, as when you look up the word apathy to find it defined as indifference, and then you look up indifference and find that it's defined as apathy. In spite of the fact that definitions are basically words about words, some people put an awful lot of stock in definitions, ignoring the fact that sometimes the words in a definition often conceal more confusion and ambiguity than the words defined. Let me try to give an example. Let's imagine a conversation in which one person says to another, "What do you mean by democracy?" And the answer, of course, is, well, democracy means respect for human rights. What do you mean by rights? Rights, well, they're privileges God grants to all of us. They're man's inherent privileges. Okay, such as, well, liberty, of course. Well, what do you mean by liberty? Well, liberty, that's freedom. Well, what's freedom? Freedom is what we have when we have a democracy. Now, that is simply a verbal circle, and nothing has been explained. In order to escape the traps of both infinite regress and of circularity in trying to understand our language, I would like to suggest a distinction between two kinds of meaning. First, you can think of words as having a suggested meaning. Let's take a simple word as chair. What does the word chair suggest? You might remember this principle or this distinction by thinking of it in this way. Close your eyes, let the word chair roll around in your head. What does it suggest to you? It suggests an article of furniture, something you're able to sit in, etc., etc. Those are the suggested meanings or connotations of a word. The pointer meanings or denotations of a word are something else. Instead of what it suggests inside your mind or inside your head, the pointer meanings of the word are what it points to in the world outside of words. And so the word chair in this instance means this object, which is not words. Now, when you take the pointer meaning sense of words, Notice that when I say this chair, I am speaking, and I'm talking about this particular physical object. I am constantly undergoing change. My perceptions of this chair may change from week to week or month to month as I change. The chair itself changes because it's undergoing minute processes of wear and decay as time goes on. And if you define meaning as the total relationship between the observer, his utterance, and the thing it refers to, since that total continuum is constantly undergoing change, then no word ever does have the same meaning twice. I don't guarantee the absolute truth of that generalization, but I certainly would like you to consider it seriously as a way of looking at language, that no word ever has exactly the same meaning twice. The difference on one occasion and on another occasion may be negligible, but there is a difference. And I think this is a useful principle to remember in problems of interpretation. The problems of interpretation are, of course, intensified, as has been pointed out before, by the fact that with the passage of time, language changes, and with the passage of history, events give words new meanings and new connotations. In a dictionary published as recently as 1945, you'll find the following definition. Uranium, a heavy, hard metal, atomic number 92, atomic weight 238.07, of no known uses. That's uranium. The word broadcast up to 1921 meant the following: to scatter, for example, seed. And it's after 1921 that the more common meaning of that word today, the broadcasting of radio and television messages, came into being. If in the 15th century, for example, you looked under a hood, what would you find? You'd probably find a monk. And if you look under a hood in 1957, under the usual hood, you find, of course, a motor car engine. And in the course of preparing these films for television broadcast, we were previewing one of the films the other day, and one of the technicians said, "Don't you think that the film is a little bit off sync?" What does off sync mean? This is an expression that would have been meaningless a couple of decades ago, but off sync means off synchronization. That is, the picture and the soundtrack were not in complete synchronization with each other. In this way, then, language continues to change as time goes on. And we have to be highly sensitive and alert to the changes going on in language, lest we misunderstand the messages that are being communicated to us and the intentions behind those messages. Another thing to consider in this matter of context is this. Every now and then you have the distortion of meaning as the result of the ignoring of context. Some years ago, a young university instructor was asked to give an Armistice Day address at a high school. And having defined propaganda as the giving of a moral meaning to a war, he went on to say that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was a great piece of propaganda, since it interpreted for the North the moral meaning of that war, of the Civil War, for the Northern population. It happened that a local newspaper picked up that story and said, headlined the story, "University instructor calls Gettysburg Address a piece of propaganda," with the plain implication that the university instructor had called Abraham Lincoln a liar. That's exactly what it sounds like if you do ignore the total context in which this particular utterance was made. And therefore, when people are quoted, statesman speeches are quoted in fragments, and so on, it is often very, very important to get the rest of the speech, the rest of the utterance, the rest of the context, in other words, to find out what was precisely meant, because sometimes distortions take place because of the absence of context. Or to take another very simple example, Supposing you say the house had no running water or electricity. Well, if you're referring to a house in an urban America in 1957, this is a condemnation of the house. But if you're referring to a house in England in 1590, obviously it's not going to have running water or electricity and is not necessarily a condemnation of the house. Therefore, historical context is among the many things that have to be considered. All this is not to say, however, that you can throw away your dictionary. The dictionary remains pretty important. Any word in a sentence, any sentence in a paragraph, any paragraph in a larger division of speech is itself part of the context for the rest of the text. And therefore, to look up a word in a dictionary often explains not only that word, but also helps to throw light on the entire paragraph, essay, article, or book in which that word appears. In other words, it's important to consider that all words in a given context interact upon each other, and that is how meaning is ultimately produced. Supposing then, on the basis of your knowledge of the language to date, you know that the word mother means female parent. This is clear enough. You also know that the word mother can be used in metaphorical extensions of that meaning. For example, if an institution stands in a maternal relationship to a large number of people, you can call that institution by the word mother, as in the example, Mother Church. And on the basis of this, you may still come across in speech or in a book somewhere the expression, mother began to form in the bottle. And your previous definitions don't help you at all. And again, you may find that you have to look at the dictionary again more carefully to find out what is meant.
Mother began to form in a bottle? Hey, let's look that up in the dictionary.
I'm way ahead of you, old man. Now listen to this. Mother, a stringy, mucilaginous substance that forms in fermenting vinegar, also called mother of vinegar.
Well, I'll be a dictionary's uncle.
This is National Educational Television.